Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about Commander on a budget. Today's episode is going to be a Commander quick take. On episodes like these, I give you my initial take on a newly spoiled Commander from an upcoming set. I'm going to be talking about a potential direction to take that Commander and possible cards to use for that build. This show and episodes like this one are possible because of viewers like you. So if you're looking for some easy ways to help support the show, make sure you like this episode and share it with friends. And make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Another easy way to support this channel is by using our TCGPLAYER affiliate links. So make sure that you're looking for those links in the description whenever you're buying a deck or just individual cards. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. But before we really jump into this, I just want to give a quick disclaimer. On episodes like these, they are just initial quick takes. This Commander is just as new to me as it is to you. And because of that, I don't have a finalized deck build for this Commander yet. So the direction that I choose to take this Commander today might not be the same one that I do in a deck tech. And because of that, some of the cards I'm going to mention might not be in that deck either. Alright, now that we're on the same page, let's get into it. Today's Commander quick take is on Elsha of the Infinite. She's a 3/3 Djinn monk that has prowess that costs 2 blue, red, white. She has, you may look at the top card of your library anytime. And you may cast the top card of your library if it's a non-creature, non-land card, and you may cast it as though it had flash. This is an absurdly powerful commander. Being able to cast spells off the top of your library with flash is a huge amount of card advantage. Having access to the top of your library is more than just having access to one additional card. Because when you cast that card off the top of your library, it essentially replaces itself. If you're able to keep casting cards off the top of your library, you're going to get more and more value out of this commander. And on top of that, it allows you to cast those cards at instant speed. So at a certain point, you can just draw and say go, and then play on your opponent's turns. Now the only cards that you can get off the top are non-creature, non-land. But that still gives you access to a ton of different kinds of spells to build around. And again, this commander allows you to play at instant speed with spells that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. When it comes to non-creature spells, there's a clear type that stands out for Elsha. Artifacts are an extremely abusable card type, especially with this commander. First off, there are a ton of cheap artifacts out there, so they are easy to cast. Secondly, there are ways to reduce the cost of your artifacts to nothing. And lastly, there are plenty of artifacts that interact with the top of your library. Now, there are definitely a ton of different directions you can take this commander. And this is just my opinion, but I really think that an artifact storm build is the right way to go. Once you're set up properly, you can pretty much just cast every single spell in your deck in one turn. I can see this commander getting out of hand very quickly and being very hard to stop once it gets going. I'm not going to say that Elsha is the most powerful commander spoiled so far, but it's definitely up there. So now it's time to go through some cards to consider for this strategy. Now, obviously, we're going to be running a ton of mana rocks with this deck. The more mana that we have, the more things we can cast and the more ways to keep us going. But outside of those, we're going to be running a ton of artifacts that really interact well with our commander. A simple artifact like Ghoul-Caller's Bell is absurd in this deck. It says tap, each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. Now, normally a card like this might be seen in a graveyard deck or a mill strategy, but artifacts like this one are card advantage engines in this deck. Since we can cast cards off the top of our library, we want to make sure that we can control what's on there. A land card on top is basically a dead card for us. If we have mana to cast something, we want to make sure that we can use that mana. And if we get rid of that land, we might reveal another artifact that we can cast. We're running plenty of cards like Ghoul-Caller's Bell in this deck. And the more that we get into play, the easier it is for us to manipulate the top card of our library. So we're also going to be running a card like Grind Clock. It has tap, put a charge counter on Grind Clock. And then tap, target player puts the top X cards of their library into their graveyard, where X is the number of counters on Grind Clock. Now, Grind Clock might not be able to mill at first, but it can definitely mill for more in the long run. This deck has a couple of different ways of winning, and one is milling ourselves out. We're also running plenty of ways to untap artifacts. So by tapping and untapping Grind Clock, we can get more and more counters on it to mill for a ton. Next up, we've got Mystic Forge, which is kind of like a second copy of our commander, but without the flash. It says you may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may cast the top card of your library if it's an artifact or a colorless non-land card. On top of that, you can tap and pay 1 life to exile the top card of your library. Overall, this is just a fantastic card in this deck. Not only can it manipulate the top card of our library, but it can also act as a backup commander if we need it to. But outside of artifacts that deal with the top of our library, there's going to be plenty of other great ones in this deck. Semblance Anvil is an extremely powerful card in this deck. It has imprint. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile a non-land card from your hand. And then spells you cast that share a card type with the exiled card cost 2 less to cast. So all you need to do is exile an artifact from your hand, and then all of your artifacts cost 2 less to cast. The vast majority of artifacts in this deck are going to cost 2 or less. So essentially this makes the majority of spells in your deck free to cast. And the ones that cost more than 2 have a greatly reduced cost. Regardless, this card and other cards like it that help reduce the cost of your artifacts help you churn through your deck in no time at all. Though Semblance Anvil is probably the best at this, we're running plenty of other ways to reduce the cost of our artifacts by at least 1. Even with just 1 or 2 of them in play, things get really out of hand. We can essentially ramp for free anytime we cast a mana rock off the top. And then we can use a card like Clock of Omens to untap our mana rocks. It says, tap 2 untapped artifacts you control, untap target artifact. Being able to untap the right artifacts in this deck is a huge effect. We can use our non-mana producing artifacts to untap mana rocks, or we can untap our milling artifacts if we need to, or we can just cast something like Dramatic Reversal and untap everything. It says, untap all non-land permanents you control. This and other cards like it are going to untap all of our artifacts at once. This can definitely lead to some incredibly explosive turns that can set us up to win right away. And thanks to our commander, since it's a non-creature spell, we can cast it off the top of our library. Now, the majority of this deck are going to be artifacts, but we also need some other cards to make this deck work. A card like Boros Charm can come in huge for this deck. It has 3 modes, but its most important one is definitely permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn. Protecting our commander as well as our artifacts is huge for this deck. We want to make sure that we've got plenty of ways to prevent our opponents from stopping us going off. And we also want to make sure that we throw a wrench into our opponent's plans as well. So a Wrath like Divine Reckoning can come in huge for this deck. It says each player chooses a creature they control, destroy the rest. And on top of that, it's got a flashback so you can cast it again. For the most part, we really only care about one creature in this deck, and that's our commander. So if we can keep her safe while taking out our opponent's creatures, that's a big win for us. And remember that even though it's a sorcery, we can cast it at instant speed if it's on top of our library. So something like this can come out of absolutely nowhere. A card like this can especially work well with Penance. Its Oracle text reads, put a card from your hand on top of your library, the next time a black or red source of your choice would deal damage this turn, prevent that damage. So basically this just lets us put any card from our hand on top of our library whenever we want. Now there has to be a red or black source, but as long as our commander's in play, we always have a target. In combination with our commander, essentially this allows us to play any of our non-creature spells in our hand at instant speed. Now we've definitely talked about all the powerful things that this deck can do, but how do we actually finish off our opponents and win the game? The first way is a favorite of mine in Storm builds, which is Temporal Fissure. It says return target permanent to its owner's hand, and it has Storm. With this deck, we're going to be casting an absurd amount of cards in one turn, and each of those spells is going to add to our Storm count. So when we actually cast Temporal Fissure, our opponents can say goodbye to every single one of their permanents, including their lands. And because it has Storm, it's very hard for opponents to stop. A simple counterspell isn't going to stop it because of all the copies. We can pretty much win in any way that we want from there, and our opponents are going to be unable to stop us. An easy way to win with this deck is Approach of the Second Sun. It says if it was cast from your hand and you've cast another spell named Approach of the Second Sun this game, you win the game. Otherwise, put Approach of the Second Sun into its owner's library 7 from the top and you gain 7 life. So essentially, the first time that we cast it, we can cast it from the top of our library. Ideally, in the same turn, we can mill down and draw into this card and cast it from our hand. On top of running artifacts that mill, we are going to be running artifacts that can draw too. Once we're truly set up, it's not going to be hard for us to do. Another way that we can win is with Jace Wielder of Mysteries. He has, if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. So if we can mill ourselves out with this in play, we just win. And again, with this deck, once we're set up, it's not too hard to do. And a final way that we can actually just win is with our commander. Our commander starts with 3 power and it has prowess. So if we can cast 18 spells in a turn and swing with her, that's 21 commander damage. We will have a few ways to get her through, but again, it's not something that we're depending on. Elsha is extremely powerful, especially in this build. Even on a budget, she allows you to do some really broken things. But as always with a budget, there are ways to improve on the deck. So now let's look at some potential upgrades to consider. On this channel, to be considered a reasonable upgrade, these cards have to be $10 or less. So although some cards might be perfect for this commander, if they're over $10, they're not going to show up here. The first upgrade for this deck is Mystical Tutor. It's an instant for just a blue. It says search your library for an instant or sorcery card and reveal that card, shuffle your library, then put that card on top of it. So essentially in combination with our commander, this lets us cast any instant or sorcery from our deck by just paying 1 more. Because we pay for this, it goes on top, and then we can cast it. So if we need to wrath the board, we can. If we need to save our board, we can do that too. We can even go get Dramatic Reversal to keep our engine going. There are a ton of applications for this card, and it's fantastic in this deck. Next up, let's add an Unwinding Clock, which is an artifact that costs 4. It says untap all artifacts you control during each other player's untap step. This card is absolutely broken with our commander. Essentially, this gives us a turn during each other player's turn. It untaps all of our library manipulators as well as our mana rocks. And since our commander gives our spells flash, we're good to go. A final upgrade to consider is a fantastic finisher in Storm decks with Aetherflux Reservoir. It's an artifact that costs 4 and says whenever you cast a spell, you gain 1 life for each spell you've cast this turn. And then pay 50 life, Aetherflux Reservoir deals 50 damage to our creature or player. So once you storm off, you're going to be gaining a ton of life and destroying your opponents with this. Now that we've looked at the cards to consider as well as potential upgrades, let's look at some similar commanders. I find that looking at other current commanders can be a great place to get ideas for a new one. Another artifact Storm commander is Joyribet Weatherlight Captain. Now the card advantage that she generates is by drawing you cards. She has whenever you cast a historic spell, draw a card. I think Elsha might be even more powerful, but you can still learn a lot from a Joyribet build. Another similar commander to look to is Wrath Capuchin Ship's Mage. Wrath has flash and he says you may cast historic spells as though they had flash. So it's also a deck that looks to cast things at instant speed. Next up there's Melik Izzet Paragon. It says play with the top card of your library revealed. You may cast the top card of your library if it's an instant or sorcery card. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery card from your library, copy it, you may choose new targets for the copy. A deck like this also looks for ways to manipulate its library. And then there's Mizzix of the Is Magnus. She has whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell with converted mana cost greater than the number of experience counters you have, you get an experience counter. And then instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each experience counter you have. This is another commander that looks to storm off by reducing cost. And finally, there's Vivictus Asmati the Dire. It has when it attacks for each player, choose target permanent that player controls. Those players sacrifice those permanents. Each player who sacrificed a permanent this way reveals the top card of their library, then puts it onto the battlefield if it's a permanent card. This is definitely a deck that can work hard at manipulating the top of its library. But now I want to know what your thoughts on my quick take are, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't seen it yet, make sure you check out my last Commander quick take here. And make sure that you're following us on social media for more updates and sneak peeks on future episodes. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about budget Commander. So while you're at it, go ahead and check out some of our other types of episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again and have a good one.